Okay, great. So we're starting. So welcome to the Temple of the Silver Stars public webinar. My name is Matthew. I'm an academic track instructor in the Temple of the Silver Star. And this will be the third out of 6 classes in our ongoing series, Garments of the Infinite, where we've been looking at the Sephiroth. So in our first class, which many of you were there for, we looked at some of the Jewish Qabalistic sources for the Sephiroth. We looked at the Sepher Yetzirah, the Sepher Bahir, the Paths of Wisdom, some other materials as well, the divine names. And then in our second class, a few weeks ago, we looked at Greek arithmology. We talked about a little bit more about the philosophical concept of emanation. We went through the numbers 1 through 10 and the kind of Pythagorean associations with those numbers. We looked at the Tetractys. I was going to talk about the Tetractys again today, but I'm going to say that until the next class after this, where we'll relate the Tetractys to the Sephiroth more deeply. But I think there's not time today. But so, when a lot of people come into the Sephiroth in the Hermetic Kabbalistic tradition, they often start with the Tree of Life. And so I had sort of asked everyone to kind of set that aside temporarily, and we would look at the Sephiroth without the tree. Looked at the sort of the Jewish foundations again of the names of the Sephiroth and the concepts associated with that, and the kind of theosophical sort of concepts, theosophy in the broad sense, not like the 19th century society. And then, the more mathematical side of things coming out of the Greek tradition last time. So we're now going to take those pieces and that foundation and apply it to the Tree of Life. Again, a lot of people start with this, but I think it's helpful to remember that the Tree of Life is one way of modeling the Sephiroth, an extremely important way, and in a way that is absolutely foundational to the entire Golden Dawn and Thelemic tradition, but it is just sort of one way of modeling it, no matter how important that way is. So, we're talking about the Tree of Life today. All right, so at the top there, you see Etz Chaim, the Tree of Life in Hebrew. It's an interesting word. It sums to 228, which has some interesting properties. Some interesting factors too. I think 228 is 12 times 19 is interesting if you want to look into that. But yeah, I'll leave that to you. All right, we got two quotes from the Bible here. So first from Genesis chapter 2. And the Lord God planted a garden eastward in Eden, and there he put the man whom he had formed. And out of the ground made the Lord God to grow every tree that is pleasant to the sight and good for food. The tree of life also in the midst of the garden, and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. So the tree of knowledge of good and evil, of course, is the tree that the serpent tempts Eve into eating the fruit from, that causes the expulsion, of course. But there's also this tree of life. Not much else is said about it. There's a handful of quotes in Proverbs that sort of use the tree of life as a kind of metaphor. I've got one example here. So from Proverbs 11, the fruit of the righteous is a tree of life, and he that winneth souls is wise. You also see there's another verse from Proverbs that kind of involves an extended sort of metaphor of comparing like the Torah to a woman, and then it says that she will be as a tree of life to you, or something like that. So the idea of something that gives nourishment and vitality is like a tree of life. But because of the tree of life, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and other things as well, like the burning bush that that God speaks to Moses out of, tree symbolism becomes really important in the Judeo-Christian tradition, and there's a lot of tree symbolism and tree metaphors and things like that. So that's part of the Judeo-Christian tradition. And then we also have, coming out of the Greek tradition, something that's usually known as the Porphyrian tree. What this is Porphyry, who we talked about a little bit last class. He's an important Neoplatonic philosopher, also an important traditional ancient astrologer. He was the primary student of Plotinus. He organizes Plotinus's Enneads. He writes the biography of Plotinus, has some important writings of his own. One of the things he did was, so I think as I mentioned last time, the Neoplatonists, and actually the Middle Platonists before them, one of the things that they're doing is trying to reconcile Plato and Aristotle. They always treat Plato as the greater authority, but they are interested in reconciling the two. And so Porphyry takes a set of Aristotle's categories, and then he doesn't actually include a diagram of this, at least as far as I know, but he uses a kind of tree metaphor to talk about Aristotle's categories. So the image you're seeing here, this is much later. I think this image here is from like the 1700s. And there's lots of different variations on how the tree is done and how the categories are arranged. But the basic idea is that you have, so you see at the top there, you have substantia, which means substance. So substance is like a genus. And then the genus is divided into two species, material and immaterial. So you have two types of substance, material substance and immaterial substance. And then one of those species then becomes like the genus of the next stage down. So material substance is like corpus, which you see in the center there, below substantia. Means body. So that becomes a genus, and then bodies are divided into animate and inanimate. And then animate bodies are, we wens, like living things, are divided into sensitive and insensitive. Sensitive being like animals, as opposed to plants. And then we see anima, which, anima, of course, means like soul, but it's also the way we get the word animal and animate. So an animal is something that's animated by an anima, right? And then that's divided into rational and irrational animals, and the rational animal is humanity. So Porphyry sort of pictures this as a tree of life, as a tree, not as a tree of life. It comes known as the Porphyria Tree. And then in medieval philosophy, this gets used as these sort of tree images get used for classifying things. Here's another example of a Porphyrian tree. This is from an illustration of a work by Raymond Lull. So they're doing kind of classification and sort of like natural philosophy, and using the trees to categorize and display. It's not evolution like biological evolution, although interestingly, the Porphyrian tree is probably also the inspiration for Darwin when he constructs like phylogenetic trees, which is another really interesting thing too, that we have a lot of stuff comes out of this Porphyrian tree. So you can probably already see the resemblance to the tree of life, both sort of visually as well as conceptually. So this illustration here that you're seeing now, this is as far as is known, this is the first ever image of the Sephiroth arranged as a tree of life. So this cover was designed by, I don't think it was executed by, because I don't think he was an artist, but designed by Johann Reuchlin. And so the cover is, this is the Latin translation of a Jewish work by a Spanish Jewish Kabbalist named Joseph ben Abraham Gikatia. I'm probably mispronouncing that name. He was a student of Abraham Abulafia. And then a few hundred years later, the German, I think he was a Jewish convert to Christianity, German philosopher Paul Riccius, he translates Gikatia's Kabbalistic text into Latin. The Kabbalistic text, it's divided up into 10 chapters, and the chapters cover the divine names associated with each of the 10 Sephiroth. So for the cover of the Latin translation, Reuchlin designed the tree that you see here. Now, it's not exactly the tree that we know or the tree that we'll be working with. For one thing, there's only, I think is it 15 paths? You can count them, but yeah, 15 paths here. So it's obviously showing the connections and the flows between them, but there's not the paths aren't associated with the letters yet. And you see it's arranged a little bit differently. You can see Hokmah here and Bina. They're not exactly arranged into 3 columns, so it's a little bit different. But this is kind of the inception of the idea of the Sephiroth as a tree. And Reuchlin, of course, would have been familiar with the Porphyrian tree, and that's likely the kind of model that he used in coming up with the tree of life as a way of picturing the Sephiroth. And then obviously identifying it with the biblical tree of life that we saw in the quotes from the first slide. All right, so from there, one thing that happens is this model passes back into the Jewish tradition. So what you're seeing here is a drawing from the school of Moshe Cordovero, another important Spanish Kabbalist who preceded Isaac Luria. Now, this tree here is a lot closer to the tree that we know. I'll say a couple of things about it. One thing is you'll notice that some of the lower Sephiroth there have got sort of names and things like that on them. Originally, they would have all had that. They're actually like separate pieces of paper that are like pinned on and could rotate, which is really cool. But over the centuries, some of them got pulled off. One slightly weird thing is that there's only 21 paths here. So you're missing, I hope everybody can see my cursor. So you're missing the path that should be here, what we would call the path of pay. There are other examples of the tree from like Cordevero's time that do have the full 22. So I don't know if this is just an alternate version or if it was just like an error made by the illustrator. I'm not sure. But yeah, so you can see now that the paths are, except for other than that one missing thing, you now have enough paths to associate with them with the letters.
Oh yeah, see, Chris was pointing out that you can kind of see, almost see the shadow of it. Yeah, you're right. I hadn't noticed that before. Good eyes.
Yeah, it's possible they had sort of sketched it out and maybe just forgot to paint it in. I don't know. It seems odd that they would do 21 when it's so obvious. You know, if you look at the others, it's so obvious that just the geometry of it, even without the numbers, that it should be there. But I don't know. Another thing we don't know, of course, a lot of this stuff was oral teaching and not necessarily recorded. So there's lots of things that we just don't know. But one thing that we don't know is whether or not there was ever an assignment of the 22 letters to the specific paths. I mean, I'm sure they associate the 22 paths with the 22 letters, but it's unknown, at least as far as I know, whether they did specific assignments. But the 17th century Jesuit writer, Athanasius Kircher, in his book, Oedipus Aegyptiacus, he takes the Cordevero's tree and assigns the paths. You can see that the divine names arranged around the Sephiroth, they're kind of exactly copied off of the tree we just saw in the previous slide. So he's very obviously taking this from Cordevero's school. And he's obviously, the missing path now is there, and he's assigned the paths to the letters in exactly the same way that we do. He's also assigned the spheres to the planets, though not in the same way that we do. Yeah, I'm not going to get into it. I don't want to confuse anybody with that. It is sort of interesting to look at the way he does it. There's something a bit obvious about the way he does it, and very sort of natural seeming, but in practice it wouldn't actually work very well, especially not for an initiatory system. But we do follow his arrangement and his assignment of the letters. Now, actually coming later than Kircher, you do have in the Jewish tradition some other versions of the Tree of Life that get developed. We're not going to talk about these, but I just wanted to show you that there are other versions in the Jewish tradition. On the left, this is the version that Luria develops, and it comes out of Luria's school, though it's not sort of widely publicized or known until the 18th century. And then on the right, you see the Gra version of the tree. Yeah, so some slight variations. It is sort of interesting to look at. One big difference is that they're not going in order. Kircher's numbering the paths, from the top down in order. And anyone who attended the last class series on paths, letters, and correspondences is very familiar with those patterns. So the Jewish Kabbalists are using very different patterns. Chris is pointing out that the paths that are the horizontal bars are the mother letters, and all the vertical paths are the double letters. And on Luria's tree, the one on the left, actually that might be true of Gra's tree too. I didn't actually look at Gra's tree that closely, but at least on Luria's tree, yeah, the vertical paths are the double letters, the diagonal paths are the single letters, and the horizontal paths are the mothers. Yeah. All right, so yeah, we're not going to worry about that, but I was just showing you that there are other versions. And then even later, even after the Tree of Life, has been developed, you'll still see other kind of variations and versions. This is a woodcut by Robert Flood, who Flood is really interesting. I'd actually like to do a class on Flood. We've seen diagrams of his in some of the other class series that I've done, and you see them all over the place. Obviously they're what do you call it, public domain. So they get used all the time in like illustrations of esoteric texts, but and they're great. They look really cool. But if you actually put them in the context of Flood's own writing and thought, and a lot of times they come in series and things like that too. There's a lot more depth there. So it'd be great to actually sort of focus on Flood's work at some point. But you can see this is another version of the tree that he's doing. One really cool thing that I really like here is that the tree is upside down. So the tree's roots are up here in Kether, and then the tree grows downwards to Malkuth, and then you have like the palm sort of branching out of Malkuth. There's a bunch of other really cool stuff about this diagram, but yeah, we'll save it for maybe a future class about Flood. But I just really like how he's done it upside down. With the, it's rooted in the supernals and then grows like downward into manifestation. I think that's great. Okay, so that pretty much, this is a really, really short, abbreviated kind of historical summary, but hopefully it gives you a little bit of sense of where this thing is coming from and how the Sephiroth get arranged into this pattern. So again, on the left, that's Kirker's tree that we just saw a minute ago. And on the right, you kind of strip out all the stuff that Kirker's added. He's really elaborated, not just like the names and paths, but he's added, you can see like the tablets of Moses here and the table of showbread and the 7-branched candlestick and a bunch of other stuff, which is all really interesting. But we're going to kind of sort of strip everything out and then conceptually build stuff back up again. And actually, we won't get into a lot of the specifics of what Kirker's doing here, but some of the stuff. So anyways, on the right, that's exactly the same pattern as in the Kirker tree, just with all the information kind of stripped out to a blank template. So for the next hour or so, we will just start to apply this pattern to the Sephiroth and build up some of the concepts and correspondences and associations and things like that. Okay, so we can start off by putting the material that we've done in the previous 2 sessions onto the tree. So on the left, you can just see the numbering, and so you can see the ordering of the tree. We'll talk more about that, the specific pattern that gets created by the numbers in a few minutes. And then on the right, you see the not divine names, the translated Hebrew names of the Sephiroth. I've also added on the one on the right the kind of pseudo Sephirah Da'ath, which means knowledge. I've added it there. I believe it was, let's see, I'm going to forget his name. Nor von Rosenroth, who he's one that translates parts of the Zohar into Latin as Kabbalah Denudata, and then Kabbalah Denudata is what MacGregor Mathers translates into English as the Kabbalah Unveiled. I believe it's von Rosenroth who first puts Da'ath on the tree there. We'll talk about Da'ath a few more times as we go along today, but I'm just sort of showing you where that fits, since we did talk about it at least briefly in the first class in the series. All right, and then here are the divine names in Hebrew on the tree that we talked about last time. There's a bunch of interesting patterns here now that you can lay the divine names out on the tree. I mean, you can just think of how the divine names correspond to that particular Sephiroth, but you can also look at some of the patterns that you can now see in the divine names on the tree. And I had an interesting conversation by email with one of you about that recently, so that was interesting and helpful for me to think about some of that stuff. And so I'll just point out a few things, but this is a great thing to look into on your own and to sort of meditate on. One pattern you'll notice is that on we'll talk about the pillars in just a few minutes, but on the left-hand side, you'll see that Elohim appears in all 3 Sephiroth on the left-hand side. You'll see that Hod here, Netzach here, and Hod both have Zavaoth, and so you have Yod-He Vav-He Zavaoth, and then Elohim Zavaoth. So they form an interesting sort of pair, and so you can start to see these patterns. That come out when we arrange this stuff as a tree. All right, and then finally, at the end of last class, after we went through the sort of Greek and Pythagorean material, we looked at Aleister Crowley's Naples arrangement, which is very much kind of his version of like a Pythagorean arithmology. So I now wanted to apply that to the tree. One thing I think I didn't emphasize this, I bet a lot of you noticed this, but something that's important about the Naples arrangement is that the point, this is like the journey of the point. The point never stops being the point. The point doesn't like become the line, become the plane, it doesn't become matter. It sort of formulates all these other things around it so that it can gain like self-knowledge and self-fulfillment. So that's an important thing to remember, is that the point is always the point. It doesn't change. It just sort of builds up all of this other stuff around it. And we can think of the point here as, the sort of the divine one, the divine consciousness, but also, your consciousness, your individuality, your soul, however you want to think about it, at its deepest, the eternal sort of transcendental part of that thing is identical to that point, and is identical to the divine consciousness. So this is as much a story about you and your individuality as it is about just a kind of more impersonal, divine, creative process. Right. So we'll not worry about the first three lines of the Naples arrangement for now. Those are the veils of the negative, which we will talk about again in a few minutes. But we can see, number one, corresponding with Kether, that's the point. And now Crowley doesn't specifically call the next two the line and the plane, but I think it's sort of applied and it's part of the normal arithmological scheme there. So the point sort of formulates another point, which creates the line, and then it formulates a third point, which creates the plane. And now below that, we have the abyss, which we'll talk about more a few times today, and then again going forward. But for now, the thing to notice about the abyss, well, one thing to notice is that it's in the same place as Da'ath, and that here it's very specifically the kind of divide between the ideal and the actual. So above the abyss, we have point, line, and plane. And this is what Crowley thinks of as the ideal. They're abstractions. They're not sort of real existing things. They're not manifest. And then below the abyss, we start out with matter. Right? So the abyss is like the gap between the ideal and the actual. So we have matter in motion, and then self right in the center in Sephiroth. That's another thing about Sephiroth, right? Is that when you picture it on the tree, it's really clear that Sephiroth is the center. It has connections to it has the most number of connections to the other Sephiroth. It's connected to all of them except for Malkuth, which is an interesting thing to think about. That fact that, Sephiroth links to everything but Malkuth. And then below Sephiroth, below the self, you have this triad that Crowley is drawing from Indian thought of bliss, thought, and being, or Ananda, Chit, and Sat. And then finally in Malkuth, the final sort of condensation of all these things and their final fulfillment and manifestation. Crowley says that this is the point's idea of itself fulfilled in its complement as determined by bliss, thought, and being. Those are the qualities that make up existence, right? And so I've just called that fulfillment for my diagram there. So you can see how even in Crowley's version of the arithmology, that the tree is already sort of implicit in that. The tree, forms kind of some of the foundation, the way that Crowley thinks about, all of this material. All right, so here we have a diagram. There's a bunch of different, I'm sure some of you have probably seen other versions of this diagram as well. This is just one version. And so this shows what's either called the lightning flash or the flaming sword, and also the serpent of wisdom. So you can see, again, hopefully everybody can see my cursor here. So here we have, it's sort of being pictured as a sword, but it can equally be pictured as like a bolt of lightning. This is like the, whatever you call it, the hilt and sort of cross guard of the sword here. And then the blade of the sword extending from Kether to Hokmah to Bina, right? And so it's going down in order from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and then finally the point of the sword, or the termination point, whatever you call it, of the lightning strike in Malkuth. So this is the process of creation. Now I think the imagery for the lightning flash is of something that is instantaneous. Now, obviously, we now know that lightning isn't actually instantaneous. It moves, well, a little bit slower than the speed of light, but symbolically, archetypally, or whatever, it's instantaneous. And then the flaming sword, is a symbol from Genesis. Right after the expulsion from the garden, God places the flaming sword and the cherubim before the gates of Eden to prevent re-entry. Right, so the idea here is the instantaneous creation, the instantaneous descent of the divine creative power. And we talked about this a little bit last time with Plotinus about how, for Plotinus, there can never be a time when like the one exists without everything else, that as soon as there's a one, there necessarily has to be everything else, because the one doesn't sort of need anything. It just creates automatically sort of necessarily out of the fullness of the expression of like the fullness of its being. And I think you really see that same logic here in the lightning flash, and the fact that this is the creation of the 10 Sephiroth is pictured as an instantaneous process. As soon as we have Kether, we have Malkuth and everything in between. So yeah, and again, this is a downward motion from 1 to 10, from the divine to manifestation. And now the serpent is the path back upwards. So the serpent starts at the base and winds back upwards. But rather than being following the Sephiroth, it's following the paths, right? So where the lightning flash, or the is the the descent of divine power in the creation. The serpent is the mystical path, the path of return, the path of starting, from manifestation, the world, the material world, the human world that we all live in, and then ascending back up to the divine source. And so it climbs the paths in reverse order. So it starts with the 32nd path of Tav, and then you can see it literally sneaks its way to Sheen, to Resh, to Kof, to Zadi, to Pei, right, and then all the way up the tree. It hits all the paths in order, and then finally, Daleth, Gimel, Beth, and then terminating in Aleph there. Right, so that the serpent comprehends the 22 paths. The lightning flash comprehends the tree, and then together they form the complementary whole. The downward journey and then the return. Ascent and descent. We can also think of this as sort of the mystical and magical. The magic. One way to think about magic is that it is sort of going up levels in order to going up. If you want to create like material change in the world, or change in your individual psyche or something like that, you contact something that's higher up than that, and then bring the power down into the where you want it to cause change. And mysticism is the opposite. It's of going up rather than going down. And so we don't have to choose one or the other, but that they form complements. And that's why frequently the AA is talked about as a mystical and magical system. Another way of thinking that is that it's both ascending and descending. All right, so this is a really important diagram, and it's great to meditate on, and to think about. And we might come back to it. We'll talk about the way that the tree gets used for initiatory systems in probably that'll be the last class in this series. But yeah, there's a lot more we could say about this, but I'll just move on. But it's really worth spending time thinking about that diagram. All right, so for the next few slides here, we'll look at kind of you can think of it as anatomy or geography or something like that of the tree, the way that we can break the tree down into different sections. So one way you can do this is to break the tree down into these 3 vertical pillars. The 2 pillars, so you have a polarity. You have on the left-hand side the pillar of severity, and on the right-hand side the pillar of mercy. And then in the middle you have a middle pillar, or sometimes usually called the middle pillar, sometimes also called the pillar of mildness. Sometimes the pillar of severity and the pillar of mercy are treated as just a kind of duo with the 2 pillars, and then those can be equated to like Yakin and Boaz, the two pillars in like Solomon's temple, which are part of Freemasonry, and then make their way into the Golden Dawn tradition as well. So sometimes you have just mercy and severity, and then the middle pillar, is like the balance and the harmony between them. And it's interesting just to sort of take a look at which Sephiroth fall on which pillar. And there's that Hesed, which literally means mercy, or I'd also been translating it as as love or as compassion. That is on the pillar of mercy. And so in a lot of ways, Chesed, as mercy, and Gevurah, strength. Those 2 Sephiroth often kind of in a way stand for the entire pillar of mercy and severity. So a lot of interesting stuff here. And in the lower right-hand side there, I just sort of constructed this table, ways of sort of thinking about some of the qualities and things that are associated with these pillars. All right, so for qualities and concepts there, these are just my own that I just sort of came up with more or less off the top of my head. This isn't some sort of like official list or official set of concepts. I was just coming up with a few words that I thought would be helpful for thinking about the 3 pillars. So for the pillar of severity, the words that occurred to me were form, structure, justice, and necessity. Form, especially, the pillar of severity can be thought of as the pillar of giving form, of shaping things and of structuring them, which is a kind of it's like restraint, right? Pillar of severity sounds a little scary or something like that, but one of its actions is just to give things a particular form, which is a kind of limitation, right? And then the pillar of mercy, the words I came up with were essence, liberation, energy, and freedom. And then the middle pillar is balance, unity, and synthesis. And so you can see how you've got these polarities and then the balance or the synthesis point between them. These are also pretty frequently associated with gender. There's other ways that the Sephiroth and like the planets on the Sephiroth also get associated with gender. So yeah, but it is sort of one concept that you definitely see, where the pillar of severity is associated with the feminine, the pillar of mercy with the masculine, and then the middle pillar would be either sort of the masculine and feminine united, or like the unity that exists before the division into masculine and feminine. You know, or sometimes it's even pictured as like a hermaphrodite, especially when I think of the image of hermaphrodites in like alchemical symbolism. You know, the king and the queen united into the alchemical hermaphrodite. You know, all of that stuff definitely works with the middle pillar. And then finally, elements as well. The pillar of severity is associated with water, the pillar of mercy with fire, and then the middle pillar is associated with air. And that works very nicely with the qualities and concepts that I talked about there. You know, fire is often associated with, you know, with essence, with energy, and, you know, the sort of expansion of force. And then water is very often associated with form and with structure. You know, in the human personality, water is associated with the, you know, the ability to give form, to create images, and to shape, you know, the raw force that is represented by fire. All right, and then I've got a quote here from the Book of the Balance, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with, but I think it's helpful to be reminded that, you know, in this quote, there's a direct reference to the pillars on the tree. So we have, remember that unbalanced force is evil, that unbalanced severity is but cruelty and oppression, but that also unbalanced mercy is but weakness, which would allow and abet evil. So the pillars are definitely not like good and bad, or, you know, or good and evil, or anything like that. But the point is that an imbalance in either direction is something like, you know, evil. Again, we don't have really the concept of evil in Thelema, but, you know, the idea that imbalance, you know, causes harm. Okay, yeah, let's move on here. All right, so I've also got planes on the Tree of Life here. This isn't incredibly important, but you will see it, so I wanted to include it. And just because of the way that this particular tree diagram is drawn, the lines kind of like cut a little bit funny through some of the Sephiroth. That's an accident. The Sephiroth are entirely on one plane or another. So the first plane, the upper plane, is Kether, and then plane 2 is Hokmah and Bina. Plane 3 is Hesed and Gevurah. Plane 4 is Tefereth. 5 is Netzach and Hod. 6 is Yesod, and then 7 is Malkuth. And sometimes, yeah, you'll see this occasionally in Crowley. It shows up in a few columns in 777. I remember Israel Gardi uses it a few times. So you will see, it's not super important, but you will see it. Sometimes they get attributed to the planes get attributed to other things as well. Like I've seen it attributed to the 7 chakras, you know, the energy centers in the spine, which, you know, in the Western chakra system, we usually talk about them being 7 of them. Yeah, possibly some other things as well, but it's just another way of breaking up the tree. I think it's also interesting to see how the Sephiroth that are on the middle pillar have like a plane to themselves, and then the mercy and severity, the Sephiroth on the pillars of mercy and severity, they always share a plane with something on the other side, right? So there's a balance in that, and so you have like not exactly an alternation, because of course planes 2 and 3. And 6 and 7 don't quite alternate, but you do have a sense of like a rhythm of a unity, and then a duality, and then a unity and a duality again. And yeah, the planes I think bring that out. All right, let's just keep moving on here. All right, so here's a few other ways of sort of looking at some of the kind of geography of the tree here in terms of veils. So let's see, how do I want to do this? All right, let's just start at the top here. So first we have what are called the 3 veils of the negative. These are like the three veils, or the 3 forms of the knot, right, of Ayin. You'll see lots of variations on this and different things. There's not always 3 forms of the negative. Sometimes you'll see like the negative just called Ein Sof, especially when it refers to like the Godhead, rather than Ein is something a little bit more like negative theology. And sometimes you'll see the idea that like Ein Sof is sort of how the Godhead might appear to us, that God, like the Godhead in and of itself, is like Ein. Sometimes the Ein Sof Or, right? So Ein is the not, nothing. Ein Sof is like the unlimited or the infinite, and then Ein Sof Or is like the unlimited light or limitless light or infinite light. And sometimes Ein Sof Or is directly equated with Kether. Sometimes it's treated as one of the veils of the negative. So you see lots of variations there. And then especially in Crowley's work, these get numbered as like 0, 00, and 000. Yeah. So again, I mean, these are entirely beyond Kether. They're conceptually important, but for most practical purposes, there's not a lot of like application for them. So they do show up in symbolism and in Crowley's work. All right, and then we have the Veil of the Abyss, which we talked about a moment ago, and you can see that Da'ath is sort of like in the abyss. Now, the abyss has kind of a frightening and scary reputation, especially coming through Aleister Crowley's work. And it doesn't, I think it's important to keep that stuff in mind, but it shouldn't be thought that the abyss is sort of inherently that way or that Da'ath is inherently that way. I think some later authors, people like Kenneth Grant sometimes, and then even worse, people sort of following after Kenneth Grant have a tendency to do this. And it is in Crowley, and I think that thinking of the abyss as something sort of negative and frightening and something that's really sort of that destroys the ego and all this kind of stuff, that was important for Crowley's own like personal initiatory process, and it is an important part of the initiatory system, but we shouldn't think that that's all that the abyss is or that that's all that Da'ath is. Again, we can think of it as just a gap between the ideal and the actual. In the Jewish tradition, there's nothing negative at all about Da'ath, nothing frightening about it. Da'ath is a sort of pseudo Sephirah. It's not quite real, because it sort of disrupts the pattern and the set of 10. And it's usually conceived of as the unity of Hokmah and Binah. So it's not quite a thing in itself, but when Hokmah and Binah are kind of united and acting together, they function as knowledge. And Hokmah is wisdom, Binah is understanding, and Da'ath is knowledge. And you'll see that triad shows up like in the Torah and in other Jewish writings of wisdom, understanding, and knowledge. Right. And so again, as a veil is something that like prevents sight, right? So we can think of this as the abyss as like the thing that blocks perception of the supernal triad from people who are below the supernal triad. And so the idea of like crossing the abyss is also the penetrating of the veil and seeing what lies behind that veil. All right, and then we have another veil below that, a veil that falls between the lower 4 Sephiroth and Tefereth. And this is called the Veil of Peroqueth. I've got Peroqueth there spelled in Hebrew. Peroqueth as a Hebrew word, I think it just means veil or like curtain. And it's specifically used to refer to the veil before the Holy of Holies. So it's that which prevented everyone but the high priest from seeing into the Holy of Holies. So again, it has a similar sort of idea of something that separates the lower from the higher. And on the next slide, I'll I think be able to say a little bit more about Peroqeth. All right, so yeah, we'll hold Peroqeth for just a minute. And so this is the elements on the tree. So I've just used color coding there. You can see that, well, on the left we don't have spirit, but red is fire, blue is water, yellow is air, and black is earth. And so you can see how the Sephiroth are attributed to the elements. We see that fire and water only appear on the pillars of mercy and severity. So fire and water are, and you always have a balanced pair of fire and water. They sort of reverse and flip in the middle, which is interesting. We can think of them almost doing a kind of caduceus, sort of snaking up the tree, where fire and water sort of switch places and then switch back again. Like these, they're also like the Ida and Pingala, the two sort of the two channels that coil around the central channel of the spine. Right, and then in the middle pillar we have the top three Sephiroth are attributed to air, and in the bottom the Malkuth is attributed to earth. So we can think of air here in a couple of different ways. Now the air of like Tefereth and Yesod is sort of the product or like the child of fire and water. We can think of like the water of Hesed and the fire of Gevurah giving rise to the air of Tefereth, and similarly the fire of Netzach and the water of Hod give rise to the air of Yesod. But with Kether, the idea of the air there is more like the unity that precedes fire and water. So air kind of plays like a double sort of role there. And then finally, Malkuth is, you can see that Malkuth is connected to Hod, Yesod, and Netzach. Malkuth receives fire, water, and air, which of course is also the three mother letters, right? And concentrates, consolidates, and sort of crystallizes all of that into the element of earth, which is a kind of secondary element that is the sort of unity and crystallization and materialization of the other three elements. There's a couple other ways of looking at the elements. We'll see one more today and another one in the next class, but this is the main one to know. So the tree you see on the right is just sort of a version of this. It's really not different. It's just that we're kind of ignoring the upper five Sephiroth. They have to sort of grayed out because they're not really a part of this particular scheme. And so you'll see that Malkuth, Yesod, Hod, and Netzach are exactly the same on the left and right tree. But now Tefereth in this scheme is being attributed to spirit rather than to air. And so this is, again, where I think we can think of the Veil of Peroqueth. If you think of Peroqueth as the thing that's, it's above Hod and Netzach, but below Tefereth, right? It's right there. And we think of, spirit as the thing that's like hidden behind matter, hidden behind the world of the elements, the thing that is their unity, their essence, their source, all that, but it's also concealed by them. The Veil of Peroqueth is like what separates or what blocks the vision of or your perception. That's a good way of saying it. So it blocks your perception that behind the multiplicity of the elements is the singularity and unity of spirit. Yeah, so one way of thinking about this is especially important in some initiatory patterns. Being able to see spirit behind the elements, right? That's a way of thinking about sort of looking through or penetrating through the Veil of Peroqueth to see the unity behind. This pattern also works very well for like the human personality, right? Malkuth is like the body. Yesod is kind of the subtle body, like the etheric astral bodies, also like the personal unconscious, the instincts, the drives, that type of stuff. And then Hod is more like the human intellect and the human mind. And then Netzach is things like will and desire, not necessarily the true will, that's something higher up on the tree, but like the faculty of will and desire, force, energy, all that kind of stuff. And then Tefereth as spirit is like the soul, I guess we could say, the unity that is behind those things, the true core of the individuality, right? And we could say, maybe, again, it's just sort of one way of thinking about it, that like Tefereth would be like the thing that reincarnates, whereas, Netzach, the lower four elements are the temporary like garments that, that the spirit puts on in individual incarnations. All right, let's keep moving on here. We're doing pretty well on time, actually. I cut out some things that I thought we were going to have time for, but yeah, we can take a little time on the next few things, I think. All right, so from the elements, let's look at not just the planets, but also cosmology. So we've got two different cosmologies that we kind of need to reckon with here. We have the geocentric model and then the heliocentric model. So, the geocentric model, of course, is the traditional model, that we see going, all the way back into the ancient traditions. This tree, it's geocentric, meaning that the Earth is at the center. And so the Earth is conceived of as, the fixed thing, right? In this model, right, the Earth doesn't orbit and doesn't rotate, and it's at the center of things, and everything else turns around the Earth. So on the left here, this is a diagram from the early 1500s. I can't remember the name of the artist now that did this, but yeah, early 1500s. And so you see in the center, we have the four elements. So we can kind of see land, maybe a little bit hard to see, but you can see land in the center, that's Earth, and then water around that, and then the air around that, like the atmosphere, and then fire around that. It was thought that above, like the air that we breathe, higher up than that, you also have, like a realm of fire or aether. Right. This is kind of again, this idea that we've talked about it a few times before. I think maybe not in this series, but in some of the previous series of the kind of Aristotelian notion of the elements having their proper places. So Earth is the heaviest and sinks the lowest, and then water sits on top of that, and then fire and air rise. But because fire is hotter, fire rises the highest. So this is following like an Aristotelian model of the elements. And then, right, and so those four elements, they make up the mortal world, right, the world of generation and corruption. And then in Aristotle's model, beyond the material world, you have the celestial world, which is beyond generation and corruption and change. Of course, that's wrong. And that's an interesting topic, too, is about people realizing that things actually do change, and things like comets and supernova actually exist beyond the sphere of the moon, whereas Aristotelians always insisted that it was below the sphere of the moon because nothing can change beyond the sphere of the moon. Anyways, it's a little bit of a tangent. But yeah, so then you can see beyond the fiery sphere there, you can see the sphere of the moon, then the sphere of Mercury, then Venus, then the Sun, then Mars, then Jupiter, and then Saturn. And so these are conceived of as spheres. They sometimes get talked about as like crystalline spheres or crystal spheres, though generally the conception wasn't that they were actually something like hard, but that they were solid in the sense of like fixed and definite, but they were often conceived of as actually being made of some sort of a subtle fluid, rather than like an actual like hard material like crystal sphere. But they are conceived of as spheres. So again, we're looking at a kind of like cutaway diagram here. They're not circles; they're spherical. And then the planet, the star, is like fixed or embedded or whatever in that sphere. And the rotation of the entire sphere is what gives the rotation of the motion of the planets. Now, beyond the sphere of Saturn, there's some different ways that the other stuff gets conceived of. What it looks like it's happening here is that you've got like a ring of the stars, especially specifically the constellations, and you can see the symbols of the 12 zodiac signs there. And then beyond that, you have like the outer crystal sphere, which is usually treated as somewhat slightly different than like the sphere of the stars. And the fact that they're offset a little bit there, I assume is about the fact that the tropical zodiac doesn't line up with the constellation. So I assume that's what's being depicted there. And then in the outer sphere here, you see that this is the primum mobile. This is, again, part of Aristotle's cosmology. The primum mobile is the first mover, also called the cause of causes or the uncaused cause. Now, for Aristotle, this is God, but Aristotle's God doesn't really do much of anything. It actually doesn't do anything at all. The only thing it really does is it sort of eternally contemplates its own nature. It doesn't need or want anything. It has no real relationship to anything below it. But since everything else sort of desires and seeks God, that's why you get the rotate. That's how the motion of the spheres is produced. The primum mobile sort of serves to give motion to everything else, though it's really the other things that have their motion because they seek it rather than it like giving motion. And Aristotle's universe is eternal in time. It's always existed and always will exist. So Aristotle's God isn't a creator either. But this obviously doesn't really work in a Christian model. So the Christians add beyond the primum mobile what here is called the Coelum Imperium Habitaculum Dei et Omnia Electorum. So this is the Empyrean heaven, the habitat of God and all of the elect. The elect here means like, the saved, those who have been, who their souls have been saved, through faith or and everything else, part of Christian soteriology. And they dwell with God beyond the primum mobile. So that's sort of a change that they make to the Aristotelian system. All right, and then on the right, we have the heliocentric model. Now, this particular diagram is really cool for a bunch of different reasons. This drawing is done by a guy named Thomas Digges. He was an Englishman. He was a mathematician, an astronomer, and an astrologer. He published an almanac for many years and also wrote some books. Diggs, yeah, there's a bunch of interesting things about Diggs. He, after his father died, he came under the guardianship of John Dee. So Dee was about 20 years older than Diggs. Dee's born in, I think, 1527, and then Diggs was born in like the late 1540s, which makes Diggs and Giordano Bruno are almost exactly the same age. They were born just like 2 or 3 years apart, I think. And then Diggs dies in 1595, dies fairly young. And then Bruno is burned at the stake in 1600. So anyways, this is from Diggs. I believe this is 1576. This is like the title page of Diggs's book, which is called a Perfect Description of the Celestial Orbs According to the Most Ancient Doctrine of the Pythagoreans, etc. And so this is actually the first work to expound and elaborate on, or to present the Copernican heliocentric model in English, which is a unique distinction. Yeah, Diggs is an interesting guy. He ends up eventually serving on the council that makes the decision for England to convert to the Gregorian calendar, which had actually been proposed by John Dee some number of years earlier. Diggs did some other important work too, did actual experimental science in support of like the Copernican model. There was an Aristotelian like objection to, anyway, actually I won't get into that, but he did some interesting experimental stuff too that helped to support the idea of a heliocentric model. But so even though this is like essentially the Copernican model of the universe, Diggs is calling it according to the most ancient doctrine of the Pythagoreans, which is really interesting. Now that's not exactly accurate. The Pythagorean cosmology, although it does involve the Earth orbiting around a central fire, the Pythagoreans have the sun also orbiting around the central fire, and the Pythagoreans also add like a counter Earth, a kind of invisible planet, basically just to get to the number 10. So they're not quite at heliocentrism, but Diggs is obviously associating the Copernican model with the Pythagorean, which is cool, especially with some of the stuff we talked about last time and the importance of the Pythagorean tradition. All right, and then this diagram is really cool too, so I'll walk you through that. So in the center here, we have the sun, right? This is the heliocentric model. And then around that, it says the orb of Mercury in 80 days, right? That's Mercury is an orbital period. And then around that, the orb of Venus revolveth round in 9 months. That's Venus's orbital period. And then here we see, this is like the Earth, and you can kind of see the atmosphere and then the fire around it. So sort of mimicking, the elemental world that we saw in the diagram on the left. And then you can see around the Earth is another circle, and there's a little object on that. That's the moon, revolving around the Earth. And the text there says, the great orb carrying this globe of mortality, his circular period determineth our year. All right, and then around that we have the orb of Mars making his revolution in 2 years, and then the orb of Jupiter making his period in 12 years, and then the orb of Saturn making his revolution in 30 years. Now around that, one thing that Diggs also differs from, and actually differs from Copernicus, where Copernicus still has the idea of like a sphere of fixed stars. Diggs, and this is something that Bruno proposed as well, and it had been proposed earlier. I think Nicholas of Pisa had proposed it as well, that instead of a sphere of fixed stars, you actually have an infinitely large cosmos with an infinite number of stars at varying distances. Although Diggs also pointed out that there's sort of a paradox of that if that were really true, the sky wouldn't be dark at night. So he's kind of wrestling with some of the philosophical problems of this new model and how to think about it. So in this now infinite sphere of stars that's replaced the sphere of fixed stars, Diggs writes, this orbit of stars fixed infinitely up extendeth itself in altitude spherically, and therefore immovable. The palace of felicity garnished with perpetual shining glorious lights innumerable, far exceeding our sun both in quantity and quality, the very court of celestial angels, devoid of grief and replenished with perfect endless joy, the habitacle for the elect. So that's really great. I really love the phrase, palace of felicity garnished with perpetual shining glorious lights innumerable. I think that's really cool. But you can also see that these two diagrams here aren't really that different. The Earth and the Sun have sort of swapped places, and the Moon now orbits the Earth rather than orbiting the Sun. But there's something very similar about them. Now this will of course change later, be further developed. In the Copernican model, the orbits are still perfectly circular, and then is that Kepler, I think, that works out that the orbits are actually elliptical. So there are still some changes and developments to be made from here, but this is pretty close to the model that we still follow today. All right, so moving backwards a little bit in time. So again, like Diggs's diagram there, that's like 1576. Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa, the important Renaissance esotericist, he publishes the 3 books on occult philosophy, a work we've talked about a number of times before. He writes it mainly in 1510, 11, 12, and then puts it aside for a while, and then comes back and revises it in the early 1530s. And it gets published in I think 1533, 1534. The 3 books are published separately. But he's still using the geocentric model. Copernicus's, I forget what the work is called, something about on the orbits of the celestial spheres, something like that. That's not published until I think 10 years later. I think that's 1543. So Agrippa is still working with the geocentric cosmology. But one thing that Agrippa does, and the reason this is important for us, is he takes the geocentric cosmology and equates it with the Sephiroth. So on the left there, you see, this is just another version of the geocentric model. I think it's pretty cool. It shows that Coela for Atlas, that means something like heaven-bearing Atlas, holding the spheres there. And you can see basically exactly the same model, although it ends with the prima mobile. It doesn't have that extra part that we talked about for God and the elect, but following exactly the same pattern. And you can see it's a little more elaborated. We've got like the celestial equator, the 2 tropics, the band of the zodiac there. And again, remember that this is all spheres that have been sort of cut away so you can see inside of them. All right, yeah, so what Agrippa does is, takes these spheres and equates them with the Sephiroth. So in doing this, it's not just like, oh, now we can attribute the planets to the Sephiroth, but it's also that the Tree of Life becomes a cosmological map. Which I think is really important and really interesting, and is a big sort of new thing. Sephiroth don't really get used that way before Agrippa. So Agrippa has to shift things around slightly. One thing that's different is you'll notice in the diagram on the left, they're numbered in the opposite way. So you'll see that the sphere of the elements doesn't get a number, and then the moon starts with number 1, and then it counts outwards to the prima mobile, which is 10. So for this to work with the Tree of Life, you have to kind of number in the opposite direction, and we need to give a number to the sphere of the elements. So what we'll do is collapse the sphere of the fixed stars with the crystalline sphere that's around that into a single thing. So we'll have the highest, the prima mobile, then the sphere of the fixed stars. Sometimes this is also more specifically given as just like the band of the zodiac. In practice, it doesn't really make that. Sometimes that's important for symbolic reasons, but there's no real contradiction. The zodiac is just one section of the sphere of fixed stars. And then we have the 7 planetary spheres below that, and at the bottom we have the elements, or the terrestrial globe. And he just equates them to the Sephiroth in order. Now, Agrippa doesn't use the Tree of Life model. Agrippa has the idea of the Sephiroth, but he doesn't know the Tree of Life. Well, he might have been aware of it, but it doesn't appear in 3 books of occult philosophy, unless I've just missed it. But it's possible that he could have known about it, like through Reuchlin. I don't know if he and Reuchlin, anyways, it's a different thing there. But anyways, so we can now look at this on the tree, right? And so again, just assigning everything in order here. Kether, prima mobile. Hokma is the fixed stars or the zodiac. Bina is the sphere of Saturn. Hesed is Jupiter. Gevra Mars. Tefereth is the sun. Netzach is Venus. Hod is Mercury. And then Yesod is the moon. And then Malkuth is the elements, the terrestrial world that we live in. Now, as I said, this is obviously following like the geocentric model rather than the heliocentric. But if we look at the diagram here, you can see that the sun is in the center. Which is a way that I think these things sort of work nicely. And, although, of course, the heliocentric model is, one of the really big arguments for the heliocentric model is just that it makes the math simpler. You can sort of do the math with a geocentric model, and that's something that like Tycho Brahe actually tries to reconcile the heliocentric and geocentric models. It's super awkward, and you can do it, but it makes the math way more complicated. So for physical modeling, of course, the heliocentric is the correct one. But you can also think of the geocentric model being the way that the universe appears to us. I mean, although we know that the Earth, orbits around the sun and that it spins, we don't experience that spin and that orbit. And we experience, the sun rising in the east and setting in the west. The moon and the planets, moving around us. So we can think of, the geocentric model being like the way that things appear to us. And there are aspects of the geocentric model that aren't totally wrong. Like you'll see that, the closest sphere to the sphere of the elements, of course, is the sphere of the moon. And then the closest one, which is true, the moon is the closer to us than any other body. But then after that, we have the sphere of Mercury. Now, if you just look at the heliocentric model, you might think, oh, okay, that's wrong. It's actually Venus that's closer to us than Mercury. And that's true if you think of the orbit of Venus is closer to our orbit than it is to Mercury's orbit. But if you actually look at what percentage of time one planet is closer to us than the other, Mercury is actually the closest planet to Earth, I think it's about 45% of the time. And then about 35% of the time, Venus is the closest planet, and then the remaining, whatever percent there, 10% or whatever, or whatever, 15. I forget what I said. Anyways, and then the remaining time, it's Mars. So on average, Mercury actually is the closest planet to Earth. And I don't know if this is true of the outer planets, but at least up through Saturn, Mercury is actually the closest planet to all of the other planets because he never deviates far from the center, from the orbital center of the planets, which is really cool. If you think of Mercury as the messenger, he's like the closest planet to all of the planets. That works really, really nicely, I think. Let's see. Yeah, so I think there's a way of giving some creative, some legitimacy to the geocentric model, even though we know that it's not actually a very accurate model of the physical universe. There's still a way that it has use, and it doesn't sort of make the tree of life diagram or like a Agrippa's scheme illegitimate. It just means we need to think about it in a slightly different way. I'll point out some interesting patterns. Now, of course, the way the planets are fixed here is just determined by their ordering. But there's some interesting patterns that fall out of this. So we just sort of ignore the elements, the prima mobile, and the fixed stars for a minute, and we'll just look at the 7 planets here, or the spheres of the 7 planets. If we look at the pillars, we'll notice that on the middle pillar, you have the 2 luminaries, the sun and the moon. On the pillar of mercy, that's the pillar on the right, we have what in traditional astrology are called the 2 benefics. That's Venus and Jupiter. Venus and Jupiter, as the benefics, they're the most beneficial planets, the most pleasant, the most desirable, and they tend to bring, good things into our lives. Venus is a bit more personal, and then Jupiter is a bit bigger and more abstract. But yeah, they tend to bring sort of good things, pleasant things, helpful things. In terms of their qualities, they tend to be more mild than the Saturn and Mars, which are the malefics. And you can see them on the left-hand side. Saturn is like extremely cold and extremely dry. Mars is extremely hot and extremely dry. Whereas Venus is sort of cool and moist, but mild, and Jupiter is warm and moist but mild. So it's not that Saturn and Mars are like bad, and Jupiter and Venus are good. They're all necessary parts of the cosmos. But Saturn and Mars represent difficulties and things that are hard, or things that can be sort of threatening or difficult, which is undeniably a part of life, right? It's not all fun and games, right? There are and they represent positive qualities as well, right? I mean, Mars is not just sort of strife or antagonism. Mars is also courage and heroism and strength. And there would be no need for courage if there wasn't any such thing as fear or pain, right? So some things that we think of as virtues require there to be suffering. It doesn't mean that Mars and Saturn are bad. But similarly, Saturn represents perseverance, over long periods of time, and the shouldering of responsibilities, and those things are important. though without heaviness and without suffering, there would be no need to develop those virtues. But the thing that's a little weird here is that you have Mercury. Now, in traditional astrology, the planets end up getting divided up into these different categories, like the two luminaries, the two benefics, the two malefics. They get split into day and night planets, split into male and female, and Mercury never fits into any of those categories. Mercury is either can be either or both or neither. So one of Mercury's sort of functions in traditional astrology is to deny the division into like binary categories. But it has to fall somewhere on the tree. And so it ends up getting put onto the pillar of severity with the malefics. And so I'd always just sort of thought like, oh, well, it's just a kind of accident of the way that things happen, but there's no real significance to that fact. But Benjamin Dykes, who he's most well known as he's a scholar and a traditional astrologer. He's doing a lot of translations of especially like Arabic and Persian astrological material. But he also has he was a former philosophy professor, and so he has a background in traditional philosophy, and he also has a background in the Golden Dawn tradition. And so I was listening to a lecture of his, and he was talking about the arrangements of the planets on the tree, and he actually has a theory about how sort of Mercury makes sense as being grouped with the malefics, which is that I don't want to get too far off on this, but in traditional astrology, there's a group of things that are called either the Arabic parts or the Hermetic lots. There are these like 7 points that are calculated. They're based on sort of adding and subtracting the like ecliptic longitude of the different planets. We won't get into the specifics of how that's done, but each one of these things, you might be familiar with like the most well-known one used today is like the part of fortune or the lot of fortune. Some of you are probably familiar with that, or the lot of spirit. The lot of fortune is assigned to the moon, and the lot of spirit is assigned to the sun. And now the lots assigned to Jupiter and Venus are, as you might expect, the lots of Jupiter and Venus, as you might expect, represent sort of your good, positive things, and the lots for Saturn and Mercury represent, difficulty and hardship and things like that. And so you can use these lots and the position of them in someone's chart to talk about, where they'll have difficulties or where things will be easier, right? But the lot associated with Mercury is also a place or a lot associated with difficulties and hardships. So if you bring in this idea of the lots, it makes perfect sense that Mercury would be grouped with the malefics. So yeah, I don't know. Again, this wasn't intended. This just sort of falls out of the ordering and the pattern of the tree. But I really like that Dykes was able to come up with a kind of conceptual rationale for Mercury being on the pillar of severity. Mercury also makes a lot of sense there too. The giving of form and like the making of structure, especially think of like Mercury and Virgo or something like that, about structuring things and categorizing things is very much what Mercury does. So it sort of makes sense that he would be on the pillar associated with form. Let's see a couple of comments here. Let's see, Kristen says that fits since it's hermaphroditic. Sorry, I probably missed when your comment came in. I'm sure it was appropriate, but I didn't see exactly what you were responding to. But yeah, Mercury is certainly hermaphroditic, especially in traditional astrology. Yeah, and then let's see, Sinisha comment says, Mercury as trickster is a kind of malefic as well. Yeah, sure. Again, from a traditional perspective, Mercury can kind of function as like more of a benefic or of a malefic, depending on like what it's configured to. But yeah, I like that line of thinking. Okay, so let's look at a slightly different variation here because it gives us another important pattern for ceremonial magic. So I've dropped out, the elements, the prima mobile and the sphere of the fixed stars, and what I've done is move Saturn from Binah to Da'ath. And so when this happens, when Saturn gets associated with Da'ath, it's not that Da'ath is like particularly Saturnian, it's just that Da'ath can sort of stand in for the supernal triad, which is another reason that it's important to not think of Da'ath as something just sort of like negative and scary, that Da'ath can represent the entire supernal triad. So in this arrangement, I think that's how, and Saturn is like the furthest planet out and represents, the kind of the limits of the celestial world. And so it makes perfect sense that Saturn would be, kind of on the abyss and like the limit and the border between the supernal and that which is below the supernal. Now, if we do this and you take the planets and you keep them in exactly that same pattern, but put them onto a hexagram, we get the attributions of the planets to the points of the hexagram. And so this is why this is why the points of the hexagram are attributed to the planets in the way that they are. It's modeled on the Tree of Life. There's some interesting patterns on the hexagram. You can see that obviously the sun is in the center, which again is a kind of, we get a bit of a heliocentric thing happening here. And the Earth would, of course, be sort of left out. But you do have the idea of the sun in the center and the other planets like orbiting around that center. And you can see some of the opposites, too. If you look like across the hexagram, you see that Mars is opposite to Venus, right? And we see that in the zodiac. The domiciles of Mars are opposite to the domiciles of Venus, right? Aries is opposite Libra, and Taurus is opposite Scorpio. And similarly, we have Mercury opposite Jupiter, and Mercury's domiciles are opposite Jupiter's domiciles. Virgo is opposite Pisces, and Gemini is opposite Sagittarius. And then we have Saturn opposite the Moon, and now one of Saturn's domiciles, Capricorn, is opposite to the Moon's domicile of Cancer. And of course, Saturn is the other, Aquarius is opposite Leo, which is the Sun's domicile. So you get that sort of nice pattern here as well of these opposites. And they're sort of contrary, right? Like Mars and Venus are very much sort of, Venus is harmony and Mars is strife. Jupiter is like kind of, unity and like non-separation of things, of combining things together. And then Mercury is like, division and structure. And similarly, Saturn is the dark, sort of heavy planet. And the luminaries, the sun and moon are vitality and life and light and brightness. So we get all these nice patterns of opposites here too. It's a little bit hard to see on the tree, but when you put them on the hexagram, it becomes really obvious that stuff is there. I'm probably after this, there's a couple of sort of one-off classes that I'd like to do, but maybe starting in like December or January, I'll probably do a series on hexagram rituals and on astroplanetary and zodiacal magic. So we'll have a lot of time to talk. Well, we can come back and really talk about the hexagram in that series. Yeah, there's a bunch of cool stuff. I'm going to talk about the intercursal hexagram and a lot of other things too that are really interesting. See, I feel like there's something else I was going to say. Oh, right. So you'll also see, I just sort of left this out. It's not extremely important. And to be honest, I don't really love the way that it usually gets done. You'll also see the outer planets, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, also put onto the Tree of Life. That's something you can do. You can see it in a lot of Crowley's books. Crowley includes that and works that stuff out. I don't know. Some of the way that gets done doesn't always make a ton of sense to me, and it's also not super important. I think that it really makes a lot more conceptual sense to think of Pokemon as like, the sphere of the fixed stars, and then you can kind of include like the outer planets there too. But attribute like Kether to Pluto just doesn't, doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. But it is something that you should be aware of and something that you will see, and it's not always done the same way. So it's something to look out for, but I'm not going to go through it right now. Okay, let's just move on here. Almost at the end here. We might actually finish on time for once. First and only time. Okay, so here we've got something called the pattern on the trestle board. Now, the pattern on the trestle board is just the text you're seeing on the left. I've also included a diagram of the Tree of Life with the numbering there for your reference. So the pattern on the trestle board was not exactly authored by Paul Foster Case. Case felt that this was something that he had received. He didn't feel himself to be the author of it. He felt that it came through from some sort of higher source. But it does come from Case. I'm sure some of you are familiar with this or have seen it before. And so it's a series of essentially affirmations that follow the pattern of the tree. I'll just read them. This is the pattern on the trestle board. This is truth about the self. 0. Now, 0, of course, here aligns with, like the veils of the negative and the not. That's not in the diagram, but that's what that lines up with. So 0. All the power that ever was or will be is here now. And as we're going through, I'm not going to really comment on these. As we're going through, you should now have all the between this class and the previous ones. You should have all you need to be able to understand how each one of these refers to the Sephiroth. But I won't actually comment on how that happens. All right. So 1. I am a center of expression for the primal will to good, which eternally creates and sustains the universe. 2. Through me, its unfailing wisdom takes form in thought and word. 3. Filled with understanding of its perfect law, I am guided moment by moment along the path of liberation. 4. From the exhaustless riches of its limitless substance, I draw all things needful, both spiritual and material. 5. I recognize the manifestation of the undeviating justice in all the circumstances of my life. 6. In all things great and small, I see the beauty of the divine expression. 7. Living from that will, supported by its unfailing wisdom and understanding, mine is the victorious life. 8. I look forward with confidence to the perfect realization of the eternal splendor of the limitless light. 9. In thought and word and deed, I rest my life from day to day upon the sure foundation of eternal being. 10. The kingdom of spirit is embodied in my flesh. So, there's a lot here. Again, I'm not going to make sort of specific comments about it, but the reason I wanted to include this here today is I think that, everything else we've been looking at, up till now, has been, what's the word? Not exactly abstractions, but, it's ways of looking at patterns and attributions and correspondences. And it's from those things. It's from, elements, planets, names, numbers, that all the actual meaning and significance of the different Sephiroth are built up. And so I've been trying to give you the raw material, and hopefully, in your meditations that you've done previously and going forward will help to build up more of like the personal significance of these things, in the sense that, this isn't just some sort of like abstract symbolic scheme, but, a set of actual principles that have meaning and significance, for life. And I think that the pattern on the trestle board, really helps to sort of bring that out, that it takes a lot of the concepts that we've already been talking about, and really applies them to daily life. And so, as you'll see on the next screen, in my suggestions for practices going forward, I suggest that you memorize this pattern of text, and you can use it as kind of like a daily affirmation, or any time. You can just sort of recite it to yourself whenever you have a few moments of time. You could write it down if you have in order to memorize it. You could write it down on something and like keep it in your wallet or in your pocket. Builders of the Adytum, that's the order that Foster Case founded. They used to issue, or they probably still do actually, issue little kind of like wallet-sized like printouts of it, so that you could literally keep it in your wallet. They were like laminated or whatever, so you could carry them around. But it's great to memorize too, and not that difficult. So you can use, you can just sort of recite this to yourself, either like, on a daily basis, like maybe first thing in the morning, or just whenever you have extra time. And then you can also do more formal like meditations on it too. You could do more formal meditations on the entire pattern, or you could just select out, like one statement at a time. So do, it doesn't have to be that long. You could do, 10, 12 minutes on, the statement 0, and then the next day, 10, 12 minutes on statement number 1. And then over the course of, like 11 days, you could go through them all. And then you can also do meditations on like the entire sequence. And also just use them as a kind of daily affirmation, of way of, reaffirming, that you yourself are a microcosm. And we'll talk about the sort of the tree of life as applied to like the individual human a lot in our next class coming up. But this is a way to sort of start getting some of that, and to start, I think, bridging the gap between, all these abstract, cosmological and philosophical diagrams that we've been looking at, and the actual experience of living in the world and going about your, your daily life as a modern human. You can find the pattern on the trestle board if you just Google pattern on the trestle board, you can find it all over the internet. I'm happy to provide the slides to anybody who wants them. And of course, for members, I'll put them up on the slides up on the forum too, so you can get them there. But it's also super easy to find on the internet. So yeah, here's my suggested practices for the next couple weeks. So the first one, rather than doing like formal meditation sessions on the tree, I recommend that you draw the tree repeatedly. You know, if you have like a Qabalistic notebook, which if you don't have a Qabalistic notebook, it's a great thing to have. Just a place to sort of work out ideas and jot down notes and observations and things like that, you know, to sort of write down different numbers that you might encounter and begin building up your own, you know, kind of Qabalistic, your own personal like Qabalistic manual. A great thing to do is to draw the tree of life repeatedly. One, it'll just help to internalize the pattern. It can be, especially with the paths, which obviously we didn't talk about the paths today because in our previous class series, we spent a ton of time talking about the paths, you know, this point in this current series, you could almost plug in that entire other series on the paths, since we're just focusing on the Sephiroth. But yeah, drawing the tree and then labeling it in different ways. You know, you just practice putting the elements on, practice putting you know, planets on, you know, and of course the names and numbers and all the stuff we did in the previous weeks as well. And start combining them too, like put the planets and the elements on together and look at, you know, which planets line up with which elements and whether that makes sense or not. The Sephiroth are something more complex and composite. You know, we've been looking at the individual like components, but to understand the Sephiroth, you really have to put them back together. And so if you're thinking about Teferet isn't just the sun, right? It's also air, it's also beauty, it's also, you know, the idea of harmony, it's the center of the tree, it's, you know, it's all these other things, it's the number 6. So it's a lot more complex, whereas the path of Resh is more specifically like just the sun, or you know, the path of Aleph is air. The Sephiroth have a bunch of qualities that all have to be kind of taken into consideration together. In a way, it's a little bit like thinking about the signs of the zodiac, right? Like if you're trying to understand Aries, Aries is a bunch of things. Well, not a bunch, but several things, right? It's cardinal, is its like quality. Its element is fire, and it's the day house of Mars. And so you have to sort of synthesize all of those things together. I mean, that's like the source and the basic pattern of where the meaning of Aries comes out of. I mean, there's a little like constellational symbolism as well, but especially for anyone using the tropical zodiac, I think it makes sense to not rely too much on the constellations. That's a topic we could talk about in a future class maybe. But anyways, sort of similarly, the way that like the meanings of the zodiac signs have to be built out of the quality and the element, and whether it's, you know, whether it's diurnal or nocturnal, and which planet's domicile that is, and even who's exalted there, who's in it their fall or detriment. Those things kind of build up the core of where the meanings of the zodiac signs come from. I think the Sephiroth are something sort of similar. I mean, they're built up out of different pieces, but there's a similar sort of logic to it, I think. And so this is a great way to start synthesizing all this. We've already been through really a lot of stuff here. But, you know, looking at names, numbers, the geometric figures, the planets, the elements, and then also the what I was calling the geography or like anatomy of the tree, you know, the pillars, the planes, the veils, sort of putting all of this stuff together and in different combinations is really important. And when you do it, I hope you can sort of not approach this in like a kind of rote memorization way, but be playful and creative and try things out and experiment too. You know, sort of disassemble the tree. Look at, you know, you could even start to play, once you've got the basic stuff memorized, you could even sort of play around with it and take it apart, see if you can put together in different ways, find other ways of breaking up the tree. Besides just like the pillars, planes, and veils and things like that we've been talking about today, find other ways that you could group things together, look for other patterns on it. And so, yeah, so be playful and creative and like have fun with it. I think that's a really important aspect of this. All right, so I think at this point, the sort of minimum memorization that would be good for this stage in the class would be to have the names of the Sephiroth, you know, in Hebrew, in transliterated Hebrew, and in English translation. Also the numbers, the planets, / cosmology, you know, I'm including like the sphere of the elements, the sphere of the zodiac, and the prima mobile, and also the elements. And, oh, I forgot to list divine names. Pretend that I wrote divine names right there. I think that's another important one. So that's, I think what sort of is a good sort of minimum level of memorization for moving forward from this point. And yeah, and that really will be the core. Once you've got that stuff down, you pretty much have the basics there, and now we can start, from this point on, we can start looking at some more advanced applications of the tree and of the Sephiroth, and building up like more specific correspondences for magical work and hierarchies and all sorts of other things. But then all kind of requires that you've got the basics more or less internalized. So yeah, keep working on that in the next few weeks. And then finally, as I just said, I suggest that you memorize and then employ the pattern on the trestle board, both in meditation, daily affirmation, etc. Again, as a way of taking something that is sort of abstract and theoretical and making it more personal and more lived. Because if it just remains something that's just a total, cool, abstract philosophical model, it's not that interesting, and it's not going to have the transformative effect on your life. Just beginning to think in terms of the tree of life, and in a sort of concrete way to think of yourself as a tree of life, to think of the world as a tree of life, the creation as a tree of life, that eventually becomes kind of like the key to everything in a lot of ways, and is a really powerful transformative thing all by itself. But you really have to internalize this stuff and bridge between the abstract and the personal. Yeah, so again, I'm happy to provide these. Anyone who's not a member here, there's my email address in the middle. Feel free to email me. I can provide you with the slides. For more info about our work, you can visit tots.org/FAQ, and you can find out about both our academic track as well as our initiatory track as well. These classes are being presented more under like the aegis of the academic track, but we do have an initiatory path as well if that's something that you're drawn to. And then for anyone who's not a member of either the academic or the initiatory track, we do have a $5 suggested donation, which you can send via PayPal to payments@tots.org. So yeah, thanks everybody. We're finishing basically right on time here. I'm happy to hang out for a few minutes if anybody has any questions, or if anybody kind of goes back. There's a couple of things I maybe went through a little bit fast. So if anybody wants to like jump back to something, I'm happy to do that as well. Or yeah, if anybody has any questions or comments. Otherwise, we'll see you in 2 weeks from today, where we'll talk about the 4 worlds. We'll talk about the parts of the soul. We'll look at some other cool stuff with the tree, some other patterns. And really build on what we've got so far. Yeah, thanks everybody. All right, so I don't see any questions. I'll hang out for another minute or two in case anybody does any questions. But otherwise, just enjoy your next 2 weeks. Good luck with your studying. Feel free to. A few people have contacted me with sort of questions or thoughts or observations about the series, and that's been great. That's been useful for me too. So please feel free to do that. Otherwise, stay safe, stay healthy, and I'll see you in 2 weeks. 93, everybody.